Okay, hello everyone. My name is Bashan. I'm with Politics and Prose. Welcome to another PMP Live. Before we do get started with this event, just a couple items I want to cover. The first being that at any time during this event, if you would like to ask a question of the author or the guest contributor, we would ask for you to place it in the Q&A box, not the chat section, just so your question does not get lost among comments. In addition to that, in the chat section, you will be able to find links which take you directly to the Politics of Prose website, where you can purchase a copy of White Freedom by Tyler Stovall. Of course, we highly encourage you to do so, and we thank you for any patronage. That said, I have the pleasure of introducing Tyler Stovall's book, White Freedom. The era of the Enlightenment, which gave rise to our modern conceptions of freedom and democracy, was also the height of the transatlantic slave trade. America, a nation founded on the principle of liberty, is also a nation built on African slavery, Native American genocide, and systematic racial discrimination. White Freedom traces the complex relationship between freedom and race from the 18th century to today, revealing how being free has meant being white. Tyler Stovall explores the intertwined histories of racism and freedom in France and the United States, the two leading nations that have claimed liberty as the heart of their national identities. He explores how French and American thinkers defined freedom in racial terms and conceived of liberty as an aspect and privilege of whiteness. He discusses how the Statue of Liberty, a gift from France to the United States and perhaps the most famous symbol of freedom on earth, promised both freedom and whiteness to European immigrants. Taking readers from the age of revolution to today, Stovall challenges the notion that racism is somehow a paradox or contradiction within the democratic tradition, demonstrating how white identity is intrinsic to Western ideas about liberty. Throughout the history of modern Western liberal democracy, freedom has long been white freedom. Tyler Stovall is professor of history and dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Fordham University. His books include Transnational France, The Modern History of a Universal Nation, Paris Noir, African Americans in the City of Light, and The Rise of the Paris Red Belt. Mr. Stovall will be joined in conversation by James Grossman. James Grossman is executive director of the American Historical Association, formerly vice president for research and education at the Newberry Library. He has taught at University of Chicago and University of California, San Diego. The author of Land of Hope, Chicago, Black Southerners, and the Great Migration, and A Chance to Make Good, African Americans, 1900 to 1929. Grossman was project director / co-editor of the Print and Digital Encyclopedia of Chicago and co-editor of the series Historical Studies of Urban America. Articles and short essays have focused on urban history, African American history, ethnicity, higher education, and the place of history in public culture. Short pieces have appeared in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Time, Chronicle of Higher Education, and elsewhere. Grossman's consulting experience includes history-related projects generated by BBC, Smithsonian, and various theater companies, films, museums, and libraries. He is currently the president of the National Humanities Alliance. He has served on governing boards of the American Council of Learned Societies, Association of American Colleges and Universities, and Center for Research Libraries. Without any further ado, Mr. Stovall and Mr. Grossman.
Thank you, Bashan. And it looks like, Tyler, Bashan has done some of your work for you. You don't have to do the usual, well, here's what I did. So instead, I'm going to ask you what you wanted to accomplish with this. It's a lot of work to write a book. So what did you want to accomplish with this?
Let me answer that in several different registers. Partly, and I'll admit this, I wrote this book because I just could not write this book. The idea just kept bothering me at night, and I wanted to get it behind me. But more importantly, I wanted to do a couple things. First of all, I wanted to look at the ways in which what has often been perceived as a contradiction has an underlying unity to it. Because it seems to me ideas as opposed as freedom and racism cannot exist in the same state within a nation or within a people for hundreds of years without at some point being resolved or having something to do with each other. So I hope to have people think about freedom as not just something that's an absolute value, that's an absolute good, but something that it is itself historically shaped and shaped by different forces in history. Race is one of them. It's by no means the only one one can explore, but it provides an interesting way of contextualizing the history of modern freedom in a variety of societies. And that brings me to the second thing I wanted to accomplish, which is one of my interests is transnational history. I wanted to take a subject of great interest to both French people and American people, French historians and American historians, or historians of France and historians of the United States, and have them look at how this idea really crossed boundaries and how it interacted across national boundaries and across national cultures, to explore the way in which freedom as a global ideal was both a product of national cultures and yet at the same time transcended them, and encourage discussions across national boundaries about the role of freedom in history and the role of race in history.
So there's a lot of conversation now for a wide variety of reasons about the relationship between slavery, the role of slavery in American history, and the founding, especially by people who emphasize the centrality of freedom in the thinking of the founders. And you're basically arguing here, and I'm quoting you actually, the juxtaposition of white freedom and black slavery was not a paradox. Could you explain that? Because I don't think that that's obvious to a lot of people. Certainly not. Sure. It's certainly not. That's not a truth that is self-evident.
Yeah, in the lines of we hold these truths to be self-evident, right? Well, I think this is one of the main reasons why I wanted to write this book, to explore this idea, and to argue that there's actually an underlying unity. I mean, to put it bluntly, the response to your question is that, well, white slavery and black slavery and white freedom, rather, go together as long as you don't see blacks as deserving of freedom because they're not white. Or put it another way, is if blacks are not defined as people, then they are not entitled to freedom. But mostly, I wanted to emphasize this idea that if freedom is a province of whiteness, if freedom is something that belongs to white identity, then therefore there is no contradiction in saying that those who are not white should also not be free, because it's not part of their heritage, it's not part of their makeup, it's not part of what they're supposed to enjoy as a right.
So you and I both have spent plenty of time teaching, and when I work with graduate students on their writing, I often tell them that an adjective has to be a word that if you take the word away, there's a different meaning that matters. So what if freedom is not white? What does it look like that's different from white freedom?
Okay. Yeah, part of what I do in this book, I mean, I start off immediately by saying that I do not feel that whiteness is the only aspect of freedom that one can consider historically or could see historically, that freedom has many different meanings and that whiteness is one of them, but not by any means the only one. I also talk about the whole idea of universal freedom, but by that I really mean the struggle against white freedom, the struggle against freedom that excludes, the struggle against the definition of freedom that excludes people of color. And it seems to be a lot of our history, both in America and increasingly in France as well, has been shaped by that ideal. For example, if you look at the historiography of the civil rights movement, if you look at the titles of historical books about the civil rights movement, so often the word freedom is featured front and center. John Hope Franklin's From Slavery to Freedom is a classic example of that. So freedom is defined as an ideal, as something that people fighting for the rights of blacks in America are trying to achieve, that they are laying claim to this ideal. And I think we're so used to that at times we tend to forget that what they were fighting against, not just racism, but denial of their rights to be free. Most obviously in the case of slavery, but not just in the case of slavery. So it seemed to me if you had the Black freedom struggle defined as a struggle. Okay, so what was it struggling against? And it seemed to me it was not just struggling against the denial of rights, but ultimately the denial of freedom, the idea that Blacks did not have the right to be free because they were not white.
So that would imply, though, that the distinction that you're drawing with that adjective, white freedom,
Mm-hmm.
is mainly a description of who's included and who is not.
Mm-hmm.
Is the content of freedom different if it's not white freedom?
I think so. Well, I think, put it this way, I think in defining freedom as white freedom, there's a couple of different aspects of it. There's the idea of white supremacy, of course, but there's also the idea of white identity. And that's really interesting because in many ways, and my first chapter deals with alternate images of freedom, alternate images of freed people that have to be suppressed in order to create white freedom. There's lots of people that are not white that are nonetheless seen as free. I mean, the classic example is sort of the stereotypical imagery of Native Americans, for example, as people that are enjoying a free society unhindered by industrial capitalism, for example. So yeah, I think there are ways in which freedom is defined as the very nature of freedom is seen as having racial characteristics, that people who are white, their very racial identity includes being free. And that is something that is not a part of the identity of people who are not white. So that's, in that sense, it is both about white supremacy. But even say if Blacks didn't exist, it still seems to suggest the idea that part of being white was to be free.
How then does that leave the freedmen the freed people in 1865,
Mm-hmm.
for whom freedom was something that they had idealized, they had dreamed of.
Mm-hmm.
In many cases, they had struggled for it. They didn't just sit and wait. We know that thousands and thousands
Mm-hmm.
of enslaved people fled to Union Army lines.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think they thought freedom was?
I think they had a few ideas. I think, first of all, you're talking about, and one of the things I talk about a lot in the book is the whole issue of property, because you're talking about people who go from being property themselves, and not just property, but extremely valuable property in American society, to wanting to have the stereotype, the literal chant of 40 acres and a mule, right? To go from being property themselves to owning property and therefore having independence. Because in many ways, the ultimate definition in modern sort of capitalist society of being free, of being independent, is having property ownership, of owning property and therefore being able to work not for somebody else, but be able to create your own livelihood. So I think there was that. And I think the other aspect of freedom that was vitally important was the franchise, the ability to vote. Frederick Douglass and many, many others talked about basically the end of freedom has to mean the right of African Americans to vote, the right of freedmen to vote and determine their own existence. And that is the area in which the Reconstruction stands and ultimately falls, right? Because ultimately, as African Americans are deprived of the vote, that for many represents a loss of freedom in many important ways.
So when you bring up property there, going back to paradoxes, one of the central paradoxes of Americans, not just American slavery, Western Hemisphere slavery certainly, is that you have capital and labor in essence in the same thing. Enslaved people are both capital and labor.
And labor, right.
And in the book, you talk about how liberal democracy, in essence, has that same contradiction built into it. That in fact that's a central problem in thinking about what liberty means. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I start off, one of the points I try and make in the book is I'm really intrigued by the phrase liberal democracy, because I think oftentimes we tend to forget the fact that it is in effect a contradiction in terms. That liberalism and democracy are not natural bedfellows, but in fact often have been opposed in history. Liberalism emphasizes the rights of the individual, democracy emphasizes the rights of the mass. And so what interested me was how you managed to come up with this combination of these two, in many ways, opposite concepts that becomes, in many ways, the dominant idea of self-rule and progressive capitalism in the modern era. And it seems to me any sort of modern capitalist state that wants to be a democracy has to create a structure that emphasizes the ability of the people to choose their own rulers, but in ways that don't ultimately put in danger property rights, in ways that don't sort of damage the basis of capitalist society. So, and this takes many different forms. I mean, a classic sort of trope of sort of conservative ideology in the United States is resistance to taxation, because taxation is seen as the expropriation and destruction of property rights, and therefore not a part of the world that they want to see. And yet, ultimately, if you have a democracy, if you have a true democracy, what's to stop the masses of people who do not own property from voting to expropriate the property of those that do own property? So that was those are the kinds of contradictions I was interested in exploring. And it seems to be part of it is worked out in racial terms. And this is especially true, I think, in Europe, where you do have an increased integration of European workers and the European peasantry into the capitalist system at the same time as you have the expansion of overseas empire. One of the things that really fascinated me about, for example, the whole French situation was that you have a natural opposition between republicanism and empire. The whole idea of the republic is supposed to be opposition to the empire in favor of rule by the people. And yet you have in France, the nation's last empire in one sense, the Second Empire being overthrown by the Third Republic. And yet the Third Republic goes on to establish the largest empire in French history. A situation where you have an empire ruled by a president, an empire without an emperor. And the distinction there is racial. You have a nation of citizens controlling an empire of subjects. The citizens are mostly white, the subjects are mostly black and brown.
How do you, now that you've moved us to France, do you think French readers would read this book differently from American readers?
After decades of being a French historian, I could assure you that they will, right?
Okay, you're not going to get away with that. How so?
Well, in a couple of ways. First of all, I could certainly foresee an argument that this is simply an American imposition of American ideas onto French history in a way that is illegitimate and has no place, right? And I think, put it this way, I mean, France, like many other countries, has a large body of historians that are historians of France that come from France. It also has a large body of historians that come from other countries, notably the United States, but not just the United States by any means. And there's always this sort of dilemma about how outsiders perceive French history or the history of any nation, what they bring to it. Do they distort that experience, or on the other hand, do they have interesting insights to offer? So I think there will be that argument. I think there will also be an argument that the contrary, and it really depends who's speaking, that this does represent an important transnational contribution to French history. Transnational is actually quite big in French historical circles these days, and a lot of people are very interested in pursuing it. I think another issue I think that might arise is, for example, wanting to see a more intense comparison between different European countries that I offer in this book. How does France compare to Germany? And I do address Germany in the Nazi era, but people might want to know more about how France is both unique and perhaps not unique. What does the tradition of French republicanism bring to this particular history, and why is that different from other European nations? So yeah, I think there will be a lot of different, very different kind of impressions. And I think one final issue, it will have to do with how can you define the French in racial terms? Can you look at, say, people from Lyon, for example, versus Guadeloupe, and see them as different, or should they be seen as fundamentally similar, and therefore having the same experiences politically? So, I'll see. I hope I have the chance to translate the book into French, and then I'll see in reality.
Has that sense of one another that you just described in racial terms, whether one's in Guadeloupe or someplace else, historically, how has that changed over time? that kind of
Okay.
scene. Because in the United States, I mean, as recently as say 1911, 100 years ago, you could have an official government document that saw Italians as a separate race, Jews as a
Mhm.
separate race. I
Mhm.
mean, there were scores of races.
Mhm.
Is that the same thing for France?
In France, generally, no, with one major exception, which I'll get into in a moment. Um, for example, one of the major differences between France and the United States to this day is the French census, for example, does not mention racial or ethnic data whatsoever. It's all, one of my interests has to do with the history of the French Caribbean and migration to France, and it makes it very difficult to see to what extent were migrants from, say, Martinique to Paris. Were they black? Were they white? Who knows, right? Um, the one exception that I'm talking about is the Vichy era, the era in which France was occupied by Nazi Germany, in which the state did take racial and, of course, religious data. And that is precisely one of the reasons why the French to this day reject any kind of racial bookkeeping by the state, because they say, look what it led to under Vichy. It led to Jews being deported to death camps. So it is therefore illegitimate for the French state to ask questions about race. There are other people, however, that argue that if you don't ask those questions, you will have no idea what are the needs of the French population in all its diversity and how you can address those needs. So it's still very much a lively debate.
So I'd like to come back to this issue of readers, actually. Uh, do you think it's possible that people who fundamentally disagree with you would benefit from reading this book, or would they read the first two chapters, throw it against the wall, and just say, here's another liberal, or is there an aspect of, I mean, do you think you can engage people who disagree with you?
Mm-hmm. Well, in the first case, if they do just read the first couple pages, throw it against the wall, hopefully they're developing their arm muscles and strengthening their physiques. I hope so. I mean, look, some of my favorite students have had, in my career as a teacher have been students that disagreed with me, including one student that had a Young Americans for Freedom bumper sticker on his notebook every day that he came to my class. And one of the things I liked about them, of course, was that all the other students had to take them seriously and therefore had to learn how to defend their own ideas and their own perspectives. So my answer to your question is I certainly hope so. I certainly hope that people that have a variety of different perspectives, including perspectives I disagree with very strongly, will be able at least to look at this book and hopefully go beyond just being turned off by the idea that this is some Black person talking about race, and say, okay, well, it's also a book about freedom. What does that say to me? And if nothing else, if they can, if this helps strengthen their own ideas and their own beliefs through argument with my text, well, then so much the better, because at least then they're learning something, even if it's not necessarily what I'd like them to learn. So, I've tried not to write it in a way that does not sort of simply attack people of different political perspectives from my own. People have their own opinions about whether or not I've succeeded.
So let's look at different readers. In my dream world, President Biden and or some of his advisors read history books once in a while and actually maybe even have a historian at the table to discuss it and learn something. What do you imagine if President Biden read this book? What would he get from it that would be useful in a practical policy context?
Okay. Well, of course, as you know, this is a book that actually does challenge President Biden long before he was president.
Exactly.
I wrote this long before I knew he was going to be president. But it challenges him on a very important issue: his support for resistance to school integration via busing in the 1970s and 1980s. I still think this is a very important issue, and I think, unfortunately, it's an issue. The whole issue of school integration, or school segregation, rather, is an issue that isn't really widely discussed by either Republicans or Democrats in today's America. And yet, in many ways, American public schools are very segregated. If you think about the fact that the civil rights movement began with Brown versus the Board of Education, began with a court ruling about school integration, this speaks volumes about the importance of this issue. And so I would hope what President Biden would take from this book is an understanding of why this issue is so important, and why even people that support him, and vote him still think it's important for him to listen to. After all, remember the first person that really raised this issue for him was the woman who's now his vice president, Kamala Harris, which he
Right.
did in a debate last year. So yeah, I think that one of the best things a politician could do is realize that she or he can learn a lot by listening to many different kinds of people, including people that write history books, for example.
Do you think that he and some other people who matter in a certain way would better understand what the Proud Boys are proud of?
By reading my book, you mean?
By reading your book. And maybe the easiest way to ask that question is simply to ask you, having done all the work to think about this issue the way you have, what are the Proud Boys proud of?
Well, it's interesting because, of course, this brings us to January 6th, which was something that, who knew? I certainly had no idea when I was writing this book that something like that would happen. And my first reaction was to be absolutely horrified and stricken with disbelief that something like this could happen in the United States. This was a movement that, as we've come to know, Proud Boys and other similar far-right racist groups are very active in. A couple things struck me about that movement. First of all, there was a whole emphasis. I mean, the word freedom was used time and time again by people that were actually in the Capitol building on that day, talking about defending their freedoms, talking about preserving America as a free society. They talked about making sure that their votes counted, that resisting the imposition of a stolen election, a stop to steal, as it was and still is argued, and saying that they should have the rights. Their rights should be counted as free Americans. Now, of course, you can point out that they were at the same time allies of a political party that has been engaged in widespread voter suppression for quite some time and has, if anything, increased that intensity of voter suppression. You could also point out that these were people that were basically allowed to walk into one of the most sacred government buildings, threaten to kill members of Congress, and walk out largely unimpeded. And, given that, it's hard to imagine that whiteness and freedom do not intersect in America. So I think, what are the Proud Boys proud of? I think they're proud of being white. I think they're proud of the idea that their whiteness has created America's greatness. And they're proud of the fact that they're fighting at a tradition that they see going back to 1776, which, by the way, was a date that was also thrown around a lot on January 6th, of fighting for American independence and freedom.
Okay, I have a whole bunch more questions, which I may or may not get to, but we do have one in the Q&A, so why don't we go to that? And we're cheating at first because this question comes from a fellow historian. In his response to the Dred Scott decision, Abraham Lincoln described the Declaration of Independence as a, quote, standard maxim for free society. That is universal in conception, if not yet in application. What is the usefulness for our continued aspirations to create a free society of documents defined as, at their core, exclusively white freedom? I mean, what you often hear is, well, these are our aspirations, even if those terrible things were our reality. And you're suggesting that our aspirations themselves are flawed.
Well, I mean, thank you for the question, because it's a really fundamental question, and I'm glad to have a chance to respond to it. And let me just point out that this, of course, as you know, Jim, also ties into this whole large controversy that was sparked by the New York Times' 1619 project about the goals of the American Revolution. But let me just respond by saying, okay, the Declaration of Independence has these high-minded ideas. It also has a line that accuses the King George III of having incited domestic and direct insurrections among us. Okay, the domestic insurrections he's referring to are the possibility of slave revolts. The idea that slaves would take this call for freedom and revolt against their masters. And if you look at the history of the American Revolution, a lot of slaves did leave their masters, including some that belonged to George Washington himself. And so therefore, they had a different interpretation of it. I think, to answer the question more broadly, the founding documents are important, and it's important also that people can interpret them in different ways. But, and that, I think, is part of the argument that, okay, There is the potential in these documents to be interpreted much more broadly. But I think you cannot say that with also having to understand that there was a particular interpretation that guided these documents, even if it has changed over time, that that they came out of a particular context, and that was a context of freedom that was racially defined. Now, you could talk about how has grown over time, and this is one of the challenges that America faces in having an 18th century constitution that it still holds to as the central document of American life. But it is a product of its time, and the time that it was written in was a time of a society that largely defined freedom in racial terms.
So I have a question then about, this goes back again to disagreement, about one of our challenges as historians.
Mm-hmm.
You've opened the can of worms of the 1619 Project, so I'm allowed to ask.
Okay.
The chair of the 1776 commission that the former president appointed.
Shortly lived, yes.
He has said, and I'm quoting now, 1619 Project promotes the teaching that slavery, not freedom, is the defining fact of American history.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's all sorts of issues here, right? The notion that there's one defining fact as opposed to another defining fact.
Mm-hmm.
The failure to understand that these are whether one agrees with you or disagrees with you, the intertwining of slavery and freedom are somewhat self-evident to us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, this is a college president. He said this actually to the alumni. He's influential, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
There are people all over the country. There are state legislatures now that have bills thrown in front of them that basically are incorporating this thinking
Mm-hmm.
about our past.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do about that? You're a college administrator, a college teacher, an educator. How do we bridge that gap?
Okay. Yeah, well, thank you, especially for that last phrase, how do we bridge that gap? Because it's a really important one. First of all, I don't buy the argument that the 1619 Project basically says that slavery, not freedom, is the key dynamic of America.
They never said that, right?
Right, of American history. So there's that. But beyond that, it's interesting. I mean, I think many of us have approached this dilemma by trying to, create a vision of American history, a vision of history in general, that is gradually opening up to more universal vision of freedom, right? So I can remember, one Republican senator giving a sort of list, giving a speech about freedom in American society and talking about different groups in American society, all of whom had aspired for freedom. And included in that group, African American slaves who had visions of freedom, living on their plantations, so on and so forth. He ignored the fact of who were they seeking freedom from, namely other Americans, and how did that shape one's vision of the role of freedom in history. So I think to try and bridge the gap, as you said, Jim, to try and give people a better understanding or sort of more fuller understanding of American history, it's important to do a couple things. First of all, it's important to include as many voices from as many different historical perspectives as possible, from many different groups as is possible. So, for example, the whole debate about the 1619 Project, the idea that the revolution was it fought in defense of slavery? Was it fought for freedom? Well, at times I think that has sort of tended to ignore the voices of the slaves themselves. What did they want? What did 1776 mean to them? Why did they leave their plantations? Why did they flee towards British lines? In many cases, there were many more African Americans that fought for the British than fought for the Revolutionary Americans in the Revolutionary War. There were also lots of white Americans that fought for the British. So it was not just a racial issue. But I think that kind of understanding is important. So, understanding how many different peoples looked at the idea of freedom from their own perspectives. I mean, another example is the whole history of the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War. It's important to ask not just why America did that or how it came out of American racism, but also what this meant to the Japanese Americans themselves, what this meant to people's and how they sort of link that to other parts of their own history of exclusion from different fields of employment, so on and so forth. People talk about the fact that, for example, the 442nd Division was, the most successful division of Japanese Americans. Many of those people came from Hawaii, where the population was not interned because it was half the population of the islands. So what was their perspective on it? So I think trying to consider from many different voices as possible. But I think the other thing is to really emphasize the fact that, our history has shaped who we are. Our history, the stories that we tell are who we are, but we have also shaped that history in many different kinds of ways. And we have come up with ideas of freedom that have emphasized freedom for all. I've been accused of writing a book that is strangely optimistic. And I stand by that because I think in many ways there are reasons to believe that the future is going to be brighter than the past. And looking at the whole January 6th events, for example, they were horrifying in many ways, but what was also noticeable, at least to me, was how roundly the people that engaged in that insurrection were condemned by most of American society, or much of American society, and condemned as racist in particular. I mean, Thomas Edsall wrote a column in the New York Times called White Riot, right? And, I think that emphasis on the racial politics of, of whiteness is more powerful than it used to be. And so that gives me hope. And you asked at the beginning what I hope to achieve with this book. Part of what I hope to achieve is as a reinforcement of that kind of realization in American society.
So, did you watch the Super Bowl?
I did not. I was caught in a traffic jam and went for a walk. So
there was a commercial that was a Jeep commercial that apparently Bruce Springsteen wrote.
Right. I heard about it. Yeah.
You heard about this. So here's the text. Freedom is not the property of the fortunate few. It belongs to us all, wherever you're from. It's what connects us. No matter who you are, that's our connection, and we need that connection. Seeing freedom as the shared reason for hope, for unity, that's even more optimistic than anybody can possibly say your book is. You think after reading your book, someone can really say that?
It would be sort of hard. I mean, because not all of us are free and not all of us feel free. I mean, my favorite quote about freedom is Janis Joplin's, "Freedom's just another word for nothing less to lose," right? Which I think in more interesting ways speaks to the sort of ambiguous nature of freedom. I mean, I opened my book, for example, talking about the ceremony around the Capitol building, the U.S. Capitol building, and the ceremony that was meant to honor the memory of the slaves that worked in that building. And a ceremony was full of people understanding the sort of paradox that, well, how could you have slaves building a building that stands for freedom? And one of the questions I raise in the introduction to the book is, okay, it's great to call this building Emancipation Hall, but how does calling a building built by slaves Emancipation Hall really honor their memory? Shouldn't you rather call it Slave Hall if you really want to honor their memory, honor their lives, and speak to that? And why is it impossible to think about calling an official U.S. building Slave Hall, right?
But doesn't that go back to this issue of bridging this gap? You're not going to get away with calling something Slave Hall. You and I know that.
Of course you're not.
So what do you do? So you're right. Calling it Emancipation Hall is in a way twisting history in ways that are in some ways actually unhelpful. What would you do if someone had said, "Okay, Dr. Stovall, what should we name this place?"
Well, let me take another example. This has to do with my Statue of Liberty chapter, right? Because I talk about the fact that the Statue of Liberty was also in many ways a symbol of whiteness, and I ended that chapter by talking about the fact that it's interesting that the Statue of Liberty exists, not just that it has European features, but it exists in a place that is supposedly all about European immigration to America. That you do not have a Statue of Liberty on the US-Mexican border, for example. You do not have a Statue of Liberty on San Francisco's Angel Island to commemorate Chinese immigration. You certainly do not have a Statue of Liberty in Charleston, South Carolina to commemorate the slave trade. And I went from there, and this is something anytime you publish a book, you immediately think of things you'd like to say more about. But I also thought about the fact that, okay, one of the things the Statue of Liberty obscures is the idea that is the historical fact that New York was one of America's great slave ports, that many people, many slaves came to came to America in bondage through New York Harbor. And so to go back to your question, I'm not saying we should tear down the Statue of Liberty by any means, but maybe build another statue that commemorates the slave history of New York Harbor and have the two facing each other. So you're not challenging one, but you're complementing it. Let's put it that way.
Okay, before we move on, I want to remind everybody in the audience that we are taking questions. A reminder that if you have a question, put it in the Q&A and I will catch it. It's very we're all living in the Zoom world. And many of us have gotten accustomed to doing these without actually being able to see an audience, as odd as that might be. People who have spent much of their lives lecturing, teaching, are accustomed to looking into people's eyes and seeing whether anybody is actually understanding what we're saying. So please just put anything up in the Q&A that occurs to you. So one of the things about this book is that as you read it, you're looking at a bunch of different things through the lens of freedom, the relationship between freedom, whiteness, and unfreedom. And people sometimes forget when they use lens, seeing something through a lens, they forget that lenses distort. And you look at a bunch of things through that lens.
Mm-hmm.
And another one is the Enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any hope for the Enlightenment after reading this book, after writing this book? Is there anything left of the Enlightenment, Tyler?
Well, I still have Voltaire and Rousseau on my shelves, right? So I would say yes. And one of my professors in graduate school was one of the preeminent historians of race and modern European history, a man named George Mossey. And he certainly, he drew a direct line from the Enlightenment to the Holocaust in many ways, right? So he certainly had some issues. But, absolutely. This is, because the thing about freedom is that it is a wonderful ideal. It is a wonderful ideal, even if it has this racial dimension to it. And that is what is so sort of challenging about a subject like this. By saying that freedom has a racial dimension, I do not mean to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I do not mean to say that the desire of human beings for freedom is a bad thing. And the Enlightenment is one of those periods that most eloquently expresses the value of freedom and why it's important. Now, it also has its own sort of contradictions. Voltaire famously said, when talking about freedom, not in front of the servants, for example. So there are those issues. And by the way, let me just state, as another person pointed out, I've structured this book to really argue against the idea of a contradiction between freedom and racism, and yet it's virtually impossible to get away from that practice, use of the words like paradox and contradiction, because it is so ingrained with us that it is hard to see it as otherwise. And part of it is in completely moral terms, right? Freedom is good, racism is bad. And one of the things I try to do in the book is to point out times or places where freedom was seen as bad, right? Where freedom was seen as license, or the ability to the lack of rules, of anarchy, of the freedom of the libertine, for example. All those represent negative aspects of freedom, just as in many other ways, race was often seen as good. Racial distinctions, not discrimination, but racial distinctions were often seen as good, and not just in racist societies. So that's a long way of trying to answer your question that no, I don't want to throw out the Enlightenment, because I think it gave us an important legacy of freedom, but it also gives us an important legacy of exploring the different ways in which freedom can be conceptualized in the modern world.
Here's a good challenge for you from the audience. You use the term freedom. What is a 25 words or less definition that you would ascribe to that term?
Okay, freedom is the ability to define one's life as one sees fit, in terms of one's own choosing. And let me just emphasize, in making that definition, and you asked for 25 words or less, one of the words I chose to avoid was any word smacking of the individual, and individualism is the right of the individual to choose their lives as they see fit. Because one of the things I discovered in writing this history, if you look at fascist concepts of freedom, Nazi Germany and fascist Italy also believed in freedom, but they left the individual out. They believed that freedom was freedom for the race and for the nation that was grounded in the race. And freedom, to the extent that the individual is involved, was freedom of the individual to surrender himself or herself to the national and racial goals of the people as a whole. So it was an interesting way of defining freedom and not including something that virtually all Westerners see as absolutely intrinsic to freedom, the rights of the individual.
So that actually gets us to a question that I was thinking about earlier. One of our audience said that she doesn't have a question, but she's enjoying it a lot and is interested in taking this conversation towards recent events. And one of the things that occurred to me was earlier you referred to the distinction between the individual and the mass as the relationship between freedom and democracy. If you look at the 1776 report, if you look at the legislation that's pending in at least 4 legislatures right now, one of the executive orders, one of the things that they all are concerned about is the issue of, quote, group rights. Aspects of identity politics, in essence, which sits in between the individual and the mass. So I'm wondering, how does that fit? If you're saying, well, democracy is about the mass and freedom is about the individual, how do we situate this issue of the multiple identities that have become important aspects of American politics, and not just politics, culture, society?
Sure. So there's a couple of questions that immediately spring to mind. I mean, not questions for you, but questions I'm thinking about in terms of answering your question, which is, first of all, to what extent, and this has been one of the challenges that's come from many conservative and right-wing forces in American society, should people be only seen as individuals? Should the treating them as human beings, as cultural people, only reflect their individual cultures? Is it not illegitimate to ascribe sort of group characteristics to them? And of course, obviously, that has a very interesting trajectory from both the right and the left. Much of the history of the civil rights movement, for example, was precisely arguing that Black should not be simply seen as Black, but should be seen as full-fledged individuals. And in many ways, the right, in taking up this argument, such as in, for example, challenging affirmative action, has really laid claim to this idea of freedom as individual freedom. And so there's that dimension to it. I think there's also an issue of, to what extent does modern society exist with, the idea of only the individual versus the state? I mean, that is in many ways a sort of Enlightenment idea, or the Enlightenment idea is the idea of the individual is sovereign. But part of the development of modern capitalist societies has been the creation of different kinds of groups within those societies. In some ways, they have suppressed or replaced other kinds of groups, such as village groups, sometimes such as religious groups even, for example. But they have created their own sort of affinity groups as a part of the development of society. Things like unions, for example, things like organizations of corporate interest, and things also like ethnic and racial and gendered groups as well. So by saying that those are illegitimate and a problem of free and opposed to freedom, you have the argument that they basically suppress the freedom of the individual, and the people that are belonging to this group say, on the contrary, they promote the empowerment of people as individuals by recognizing those aspects of society that limit their individual freedom. So I think there's no simple answer to this, Jim, and I think it is an important question that is going to continue to be posed, because people that belong in these kinds of identity groups really see themselves as individually empowered by those groups, and that's why they exist as far as they're concerned.
Well, and part of the irony, you made reference to people versus the state, in essence. Supposedly in a democracy, The people are the
People
state.
are the
The
state,
state
right.
is the people. That's
Right,
in a way the irony of this anti-government rhetoric, in a way, that if democracy is functioning, the government is us.
hmm That's
If
right.
it's
That's right.
functioning. So this is the kind of question that you begin to wonder whether someone has told someone what the book is about, so they know exactly the right question to ask, which is the freedom in the context of the need for a social contract, which you discuss at length in the book. But how do you talk about freedom in the context of a need for a social contract? Because you have socioeconomic differences, there needs to be some kinds of modes of control, order. How do you frame that within the context of your book?
Okay, in a number of ways. Let me take one example that might not spring to many people's minds initially, but I think is very relevant. That's the issue of conscription, right? Conscription is in many ways one of the greatest violations of individual freedom in the modern era. The idea that you tell young people, traditionally men, but now also women, that they have to serve in a military formation, that they have to give their time, no matter what they want to do with their lives, for 1 or more years, is something that really defies the idea that the individual has the right to empower their own lives. And it's by no means an accident that one of the last countries to adopt conscription in 20th century was Britain, the heartland of the liberal revolution. And yet at the same time, conscription is seen as something that is vital for defending the ability of the nation to protect the rights of the individual. In effect, protects the rights of the individual from being conquered and occupied by a foreign power, to protect them from ultimately losing their property, right, to a foreign conqueror. So it's one example, and it's interesting because many conservative forces have sort of mixed feelings about conscription. On the one hand, they're very much in favor of military service. And many people that have engaged in military service are very much in favor of them. At the same time, they often feel that this should be a choice of freedom. And I wanted to pursue a bit your issue about why is it the government is defined as something other than us if we live in a democracy. There's the famous conservative saying that one of the great phrases to be aware of is the phrase, "I'm from the government, I'm here to help you," which of course suggests that the government
That
is
was our
somebody.
former president, as I recall.
Yes, and many other people as well, which suggests that the government is coming from outside. Okay, partly I think that speaks to certain realities in at least American politics. At times, not everybody has had the equal say in electing the government. I mean, and the fact that America still has a bicameral legislature, one of which was wildly out of sync with popular representation. I mean, how is it justified that California and Wyoming have the same number of senators, and one has 40 million people and one has 600,000? These are examples of the government not being truly part of the people. So yeah, I mean, I think that there is this sense that ultimately the government is not the same, especially when you get to the scale of modern Western democracy, especially the United States with over 300 million people. It cannot be the same as people that that they've got to know down the street from you, that you can actually have a relationship on a personal basis. These are people that are simply outsiders. This is true in France as well. I mean, one of the Eugene Weber's Peasants to Frenchmen is a wonderful classic book where he talks about how French peasants reacted to the census in the late 19th century. It gives the example of one village that routinely listed all its boy children as girls so that none of them would ever be drafted. So clearly the government was seen as something completely external. And this is a Republican government that they voted for and had the right to vote for. And yet it was still seen as a bunch of outsiders coming in and taking away your sons.
And the complexity of that can get very interesting. I don't know if you remember, during, was it the Iraqi war, when Congressman Rangel reintroduced a bill in the House to recreate the draft. And as I recall, his argument was A, the draft was more democratic than a volunteer army, and B, the best way to prevent this country from going to war was to have a draft. in
And draft
part
middle
because-
class kids, right?
Yeah, because the draft, in essence, democratized warfare, which was kind of an interesting perspective.
Right. But that's also an example where you have the opposition between democracy and individual liberty, right? Because, of course, the draft violates individual liberty for the sake
Yes.
of democracy in that sense, right?
Which leads us to another question we have, which is someone who is concerned, and I quote, that people, meaning you, that people define freedom as an individual value aspiration.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, yeah, I mean, I think that is, at least in the Western world, the dominant definition of freedom, that it is an individual value. And it is also, in many ways, a negative value. People talk about the difference between freedom from and freedom for, right? And mostly we define freedom as being freedom from something. In my book, I pose the question, for example, about when do you feel more free? Do you feel more free when you're participating in jury duty, or do you feel more free when you get out of jury duty, right? One is freedom for, one is freedom from. And my guess is that there are a lot of people who opt more for the freedom from, right? I mean, they're much more, I mean, let's be honest. Are you much more happy when you get out of jury duty than when you have to participate in it? So,
Unless it's an interesting case. Well, but
Yeah.
that actually gets me to something else that I was struck by, and I think I didn't write this down, so it's from memory in the book. No, actually I did. That you said at one point that responsibility and freedom stood at odds to each other. You were referring to childhood in this case. But these are now, I mean, now you've got two things that we think of as positive, responsibility and freedom, and you set these up as opposed to one another.
Okay, well, let me explain why I did that in the case of childhood in particular, because this is part of a chapter that looks at sort of alternate visions of freedom. And I say that the image of childhood is one of those, and it's really the image of modern childhood. You know, historians have pointed out that in pre-modern eras, children are often just seen as little adults, that they just had the same lives, they didn't have any special characteristics. And then with the rise of the Romantic movement, there's all this belief in children as, you know, God's little angels and special beings and beings that have to be protected, which also means beings that have to be controlled. Because the image of childhood before this is children are free just like anybody else is, and now children have to be controlled and ultimately stripped of their freedom and made into responsible adults. I mean, the wonderful line in Peter Pan where the author describes what happens to the lost boys, that they end up becoming adults with beards and jobs, sort of says it, right? So the point is freedom is, you know, is seen in this extent as irresponsible. You know, freedom is, you know, you can sort of do whatever you want, whenever you want, no matter who suffers from it. And that is irresponsible, right? Because you have to take into account the needs of other people's. And, you know, if your freedom to swing your fist ends at the point of somebody else's nose, that means it is not complete freedom. It means that freedom is limited by social responsibility.
That's, you know, I found that very interesting when I was reading the chapter on childhood, given what you were doing, because it took me back to what was the most influential study of American slavery until the 1950s, Ulrich Phillips, who argued that the plantation was a school,
right,
and that the children had been let out too early.
right.
So it was interesting the way in which you sort of sat childhood there as something that embodied this tension between in essence, freedom and unfreedom.
Well, I mean, there's a famous statement of Rudyard Kipling about the native, half devil and half child, right? And this whole sort of infantilizing narrative is really powerful in much of European colonialism. The idea that you're going to educate and raise these people up to be responsible adults because they're really children, in effect, and that's why they're wild, and that's why that's a kind of freedom, but they have to learn to give up in order to become civilized human beings.
Well, as responsible adults, we should probably end this because it's 7:01. And I want to thank everybody who is here, even though I cannot see you. I have no idea how many of you there are, but thank you for listening. And again, the book, Tyler Stovall, White Freedom.
Thank you all for participating and for taking the time to learn about my book. And thank you, Jim.
Thank you for enjoyable